The silk of her dress, a vibrant crimson embroidered with golden phoenixes, was the only thing of value left in Redemption Creek, Arizona territory. It was also the most useless. The fabric, meant for a wedding hall in San Francisco, was now caked with the fine red dust of the high desert, a flag of surrender in a foreign land. Her name was Mai, and she stood perfectly still beside the water trough outside the saloon as the stagecoach that had brought her and her father became a small, dark speck on the horizon. He had not looked back. He had sold her. First to a man she had never met, a supposed merchant in California, and now, for a bottle of whiskey and a handful of coins, he had sold her to the indifferent, baking heat of this town. He had told her to wait, that he was simply making arrangements. But Mai had seen the finality in the way he refused to meet her eyes, the shame that fought with the desperate thirst in his face. She had been waiting for 3 hours. The sun was a hammer, and the stares of the few men who passed were just as brutal. They looked at her like a curiosity, a piece of porcelain dropped in a pigsty. Arthur Vance saw her from the doorway of the freight office. He had been checking a bill of lading, the neat columns of numbers a welcome and predictable distraction from the emptiness of his clapboard house at the edge of town. He was a man who preferred the company of horses and the simple physics of leverage and weight. People were complicated. They lied, they broke, and they left. But he could not look away from the woman in the red dress. She stood with a stillness that was not passive, but deliberate. Her back was straight, her hands clasped before her, her head held high even as her world had clearly crumbled. She was a ship becalmed in a sea of dust, and Arthur felt an unwelcome tug of something he had long since buried. It was not pity. It was recognition. He knew what it was to be left with nothing but the clothes on your back and the hard edge of your own pride. He watched as 2 rough-looking prospectors ambled out of the saloon, wiping beer from their lips. They saw her, and their lazy walk turned predatory. They nudged each other, their laughter a low, ugly sound that carried on the dry air. Arthur's hand instinctively went to the worn grip of the pistol on his hip, a habit he had been trying to break for 5 years. Trouble had a way of finding him, even when he did his best to walk the other way. He saw the woman's shoulders tighten, the only sign of her fear. He let out a slow breath, cursing himself, the town, and the cruelties of the world. He pushed the office door open, the bell above it giving a sharp, angry jingle. He stepped out onto the boardwalk, his boots making a solid, measured sound that cut through the prospectors' drunken murmurs. They turned, saw him, and the smirks on their faces faltered. Arthur was not a large man, but he had a way of standing that took up more space than he should. His face was weathered, his eyes the color of a washed-out sky, and they held no warmth. They had seen him handle a dispute over a mining claim a year prior. It had not involved his gun, but it had involved a broken arm and a quiet, final statement that left no room for argument. "She with you, Vance?" one of them asked, his voice losing its swagger. Arthur didn't answer him. He walked past them and stopped in front of the woman. She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide and unreadable. She was younger than he had thought, but her gaze was ancient. He took off his hat, a gesture of respect that felt foreign and clumsy in his own hands. He said, his voice rough from disuse. He cleared his throat. "Do you have anywhere to go?" He expected tears, a torrent of a language he wouldn't understand, or maybe just silence. Instead, she met his gaze directly, and after a long moment, she gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of her head. One word, spoken in a voice as soft as the silk she wore, but as clear as glass. "No." The word hung in the air between them. The prospectors shuffled their feet, suddenly eager to be somewhere else. The sun beat down. The world had presented Arthur with a problem he had not asked for, a life adrift that had just bumped against his own. He could turn around, go back to his ledgers, and let the town swallow her whole. It would be the sensible thing to do. It was what everyone else would do. But the way she said that single word, with no plea and no artifice, struck him like a physical blow. It was a simple statement of fact, a truth laid bare at his feet. He looked at her small, calloused hands, hands that had clearly known work, and then at the vast, empty desert stretching out behind her. He put his hat back on his head, the decision settling in his chest with the weight of stone. "Now you do," he said. He did not offer his arm. He simply turned and started walking toward the territorial judge's office at the other end of the street. After a moment's hesitation, he heard the soft rustle of silk and the quiet scuff of her slippers on the dusty planks behind him. He did not look back to see if she was following. He knew she was. The marriage was a transaction, as stark and unadorned as the judge's office itself. Judge Miller was a pragmatic man who had seen every form of desperation the frontier could invent. He looked from Arthur's grim face to the young Chinese woman's composed one, asked the necessary questions, and filled out the paperwork. Mai signed her name with a brush and a small ink block she produced from a hidden pocket in her sleeve. The characters were elegant and precise, a stark contrast to Arthur's own blocky scrawl. He paid the judge $2 silver. There were no rings, no vows beyond the legal necessities, no witnesses besides the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. They walked to his house in silence. It was a small, sturdy structure of clapboard and sod, set back from the main road with a corral and a small barn. It was clean, Spartan, and utterly devoid of any personal touch. It was a place to sleep and eat, not a home. He showed her the spare room. It was small, containing only a narrow bed and a wooden crate for a table. "This will be yours," he said, not looking at her. "The well is out back. Kitchen is there. I take my meals at sundown." He expected her to retreat into the room, to close the door on him and the strange new reality she found herself in. Instead, she stood in the doorway, her gaze sweeping over the main room, taking in the rifle mounted over the fireplace, the sparse furniture, the layer of dust on the mantel. "You are Arthur Vance," she said. It was not a question. Her English was stilted but clear. "I am," he said, surprised she knew his name. "You move freight," she continued. "To the silver mines in the north." He just nodded, unsure what to say. "My father," she said, her voice steady, "told me you were an honest man. The only one in this town," he said, "who gave him a fair price for hauling his tools, before he drank the money away." Arthur stared at her. He vaguely remembered the man, a wiry, nervous fellow with a persistent cough. He had hauled a crate of mining equipment for him a month ago. He had not overcharged him. That was simply his way of doing business. He had never imagined such a small, forgotten act of decency would lead to this. It was a strange and unsettling thought. He had offered her a roof over her head to save her from the wolves. He had not offered her a life, or a partnership, or anything resembling a real marriage. It was a practical arrangement, meant to give her the protection of his name until she could find her own way. But the look in her eye suggested she understood the terms of their arrangement far better than he did. She was not just accepting his charity. She was assessing her new position, her new partner, with a clear and calculating gaze. That night, he found a pot of rice and some kind of stew with dried vegetables simmering on the stove. It was simple, but it was more flavorful than anything he had eaten in years. They ate in silence at the small kitchen table. The quiet was not awkward, but watchful. He was a man used to solitude, yet this new presence in his house did not feel like an intrusion. It felt like a question mark. The next morning, the questions began to find answers, and they were not the ones Arthur expected. The town of Redemption Creek had a rigid, unspoken social order, and Arthur had just thrown a stone into the middle of it. The first ripple came from Barton Finch. Finch owned the largest ranch in the valley, held the mortgage on the general store, and had the sheriff in his pocket. He considered Redemption Creek his personal fiefdom. He was a man who liked order, and he did not like surprises. He found Arthur by his wagon, where he was loading up barrels of salted pork for the mining camp run. "Vance," Finch said, his voice smooth and pleasant, a tone that always set Arthur's teeth on edge. Finch was impeccably dressed, his boots polished to a high shine despite the dust. "I hear congratulations are in order." "I don't know what you're talking about, Finch," Arthur said, not stopping his work. "A marriage," Finch said, stepping closer, blocking the path to the wagon. "A hasty one. To the little stray the stage left behind." The town is buzzing. Let them buzz, Arthur said, hoisting another barrel. Finch's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. This is a decent town, Vance. We have standards. People are uncomfortable. It's bad for business. It's bad for morale. My business is my own, Arthur said, finally turning to face him. And my wife is my own business. The word wife felt strange on his tongue, a coat that didn't quite fit. Is she? Finch mused, tapping a gloved finger against his chin. I wonder. An arrangement like that, it seems desperate. A man like you, with your history. People might think you're taking advantage of a helpless creature. Or they might think well, they might think all sorts of things. None of them good for your reputation. The threat was clear. Finch could ruin him. He could lean on the store to cut off Arthur's credit, persuade the mining company that his services were unreliable, that his new domestic situation was a sign of instability. You've said your piece, Finch, Arthur said, his voice low. Now get out of my way. Finch held his ground for a moment longer, his gaze flickering past Arthur toward the house. Then he gave a small, condescending laugh. Just some friendly advice, Vance. Some things are more trouble than they're worth. He turned and walked away, leaving the threat hanging in the air like dust. Arthur finished loading the wagon, his movements stiff with anger. He had known there would be talk, but he hadn't anticipated such a direct challenge so soon. He had lived on the fringes of this town for years, a man tolerated but not accepted. He had been content with that. But now, he had brought someone else into that fringe with him. He went back to the house to get his canteen. Mai was at the kitchen table. Spread before her were his freight ledgers. He had left them in a messy pile, but she had stacked them neatly. She was running a finger down a column of figures in the most recent one. What are you doing? He asked, his tone sharper than he intended. She didn't flinch. She pointed to a line item. Mr. Abernathy, at the general store. He charged you for 3 barrels of flour. The delivery slip says you only took 2". Arthur frowned, taking the ledger from her. He squinted at the entry. He was good with logistics, with weight and distance, but the numbers sometimes swam before his eyes. He'd always just trusted Abernathy's accounting. He checked the delivery slip she had placed beside the book. She was right. Abernathy had overcharged him by the price of a full barrel. It wasn't a huge amount, but it wasn't nothing either. And here, she said, tapping another page. The freight charge for the mining company. They pay by the pound. The rate is correct, but the weight calculation is wrong. They have underpaid you by $4. He stared at the page, then at her. Her expression was serious, focused. In the space of an hour, she had gone through months of his business records and found errors he had completely missed. Errors that were costing him money. My father was a merchant, she said softly, as if in explanation. Before. I kept his books. Arthur sank into the chair opposite her. He looked at her hands, the ones he had thought were merely calloused from work. Now he saw them as something else, precise, capable. He had seen her as someone to be protected, a fragile piece of porcelain. He was beginning to realize she was more like tempered steel. The confrontation with Finch had been about her, but it had been a man's contest of wills. This, however, was different. This was her, quietly and efficiently, shoring up the foundations of his life, a life she was now a part of. She was not just taking shelter. She was earning her keep, and then some. The next day, Arthur went to the general store. He didn't make a scene. He simply showed the ledger and the delivery slip to a flustered Mr. Abernathy, who stammered an apology and corrected the bill. Abernathy was a decent man at heart, but he was a man who bent to the strongest wind, and lately, that wind had been Barton Finch. Arthur knew the mistake was no mistake at all. It was the beginning of Finch's squeeze. But as he was leaving, Arthur saw Mai across the street. She was walking toward the mercantile with a small basket. 2 women, wives of ranchers loyal to Finch, saw her coming. They deliberately stepped together, blocking the boardwalk, forcing Mai to either stop or step down into the dusty street. It was a small, petty act of public humiliation. Arthur's gut tightened. He started to move, to go to her, but he stopped. He watched as Mai paused, her eyes taking in the situation. She did not look angry or afraid. She simply stood for a moment, then gave the women a slight, formal bow. Then, with perfect grace, she stepped off the boardwalk, walked around them in the street, and stepped back up, continuing on her way without a single backward glance. She had refused to play their game. She had not let them humiliate her, because she had not accepted their premise that she was lesser than them. She had simply navigated the obstacle with an unassailable dignity that made the other women look small and cruel. He did not yet know that the deed in his pocket was not the only thing he was hiding from her. And he was beginning to suspect she had secrets of her own. The quiet competence she displayed was a shield, but he wondered what it was protecting. The real test came a week later. Arthur had a shipment of blasting powder for the mines, a dangerous but lucrative haul. It was a 2-day journey, and he decided to take the Old Canyon Road. It was rougher, but it shaved half a day off the trip. He asked Mai if she wanted to come. He told himself it was because he didn't want to leave her alone in town, where Finch's influence was strongest. But the truth was, her quiet presence in the house had become a strange comfort, and the thought of 2 days of silence on the trail now felt like a loss. She agreed without hesitation. She packed a small bag with food, water, and a few things he couldn't identify, wrapped in cloth. They set out at dawn. The day was uneventful, the slow rhythm of the mules and the creak of the wagon a familiar song to Arthur. They spoke little, but he found himself pointing out landmarks, the Hawk's Nest on the High Mesa, the place where a flash flood had washed out the trail 3 years before. She listened, her dark eyes taking everything in. They made camp as dusk settled in the canyon. The air grew cool quickly. After they ate, a comfortable silence settled between them. The stars in the high desert were brilliant, a spray of diamonds on black velvet. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice soft in the darkness. Arthur knew what she meant. "I told you. You had nowhere to go." "Other men would not have cared," she said. "They would have used me. Or ignored me. Why you?" He stared into the fire, the flames dancing in his eyes. He had not spoken of his past to anyone in 5 years. He had come to Redemption Creek to bury it. But looking at her, at this woman who had faced her own ruin with such courage, the old walls he had built around himself felt thin and brittle. "I was a soldier," he said, the words tasting like rust. "After the war. I was stationed out here. We were sent to clear a settlement of Paiute. They weren't hostile. They were just in the way of a new rail line. We were told they were dangerous. It was a lie." He paused, the memory still sharp. There was a woman. She had been left behind, her family gone. She stood there, just like you did. With nothing. "My commanding officer," he gave an order. I refused. I was discharged. Left in the middle of nowhere with nothing but a horse and a bad name, he poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the night. "I know what it looks like. To be on the outside of everything. I guess I didn't want to see it happen again." He had expected her to say something, to offer some word of comfort or judgment. Instead, she was silent for a long time. When he finally looked at her, he saw that her eyes were glistening in the firelight. She reached into her bag and pulled out one of the cloth-wrap bundles. She unfolded it carefully. Inside was a small, delicate teapot and 2 tiny cups, made of the finest porcelain. It was a piece of a world she had lost, a treasure she had managed to keep hidden. She said nothing. She simply filled the pot with water from her canteen, set it on the edge of the fire grate to warm, and prepared to make tea. It was an act of profound intimacy, a sharing of something precious in the heart of the wilderness. In that moment, the space between them, the space that had been filled with the formal lines of a business arrangement, began to dissolve. The next morning, the canyon road narrowed, with a sheer rock face on one side and a steep drop on the other. As they rounded a tight bend, the lead mule suddenly shied, braying in terror. Arthur pulled back hard on the reins, the wagon groaning in protest. Lying across the narrow path was a massive rattlesnake, coiled and buzzing, its head raised to strike. But behind the snake, wedged into a crevice in the rock wall, was something else. A glint of metal. It was a steel pin, deliberately placed. Arthur's blood ran cold. If the mules had panicked and bolted, the wagon, laden with blasting powder, would have gone over the edge. It wasn't an accident. It was a trap. This was Finch, escalating his war from financial pressure to outright murder. Before Arthur could even draw his pistol, Mai acted. She grabbed the heavy wool blanket from the back of the wagon seat. With a fluid motion that spoke of surprising strength, she flung it over the snake. The buzzing stopped, muffled by the thick wool. The snake, confused and blinded, began to thrash, but it was contained. The mules calmed, their eyes still wide with fear but their panic subsiding. Arthur jumped down, his heart pounding. He kicked the steel pin away and carefully guided the mules past the writhing blanket. Once they were clear, he used a long branch to flick the blanket and the angry snake over the side of the cliff. He turned to look at Mai. She was pale, but her hands were steady on the wagon seat. She had not screamed. She had not panicked. She had seen the problem and solved it, quickly and efficiently. "You're all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the spot where the pin had been. "That was not for the snake," she said. "No," Arthur said grimly. "It wasn't." They drove the rest of the way in a tense silence. The beauty of the canyon now seemed menacing, every shadow a potential threat. When they finally reached the mine, Arthur delivered the powder and collected his payment. He spoke briefly with the foreman, a man he trusted. He learned that Barton Finch had been there a week ago, making a big show of inquiring about the mine's freight needs, suggesting that Arthur Vance was becoming unreliable. The pieces were clicking into place. Finch didn't just want Arthur gone. He wanted Arthur's contract. He wanted to control the flow of supplies to the entire region. And he was willing to kill for it. That night, back in the small house that was slowly starting to feel like a home, the unspoken truth of their situation finally had to be faced. They were no longer just two strangers in a marriage of convenience. They were partners in a war they hadn't chosen. "He will try again," Mai said, her voice low as she washed the trail dust from the porcelain teapot. "I know," Arthur said. He was cleaning his rifle, the methodical motions a comfort. "I could take you to Prescott. Put you on a stagecoach to San Francisco. You'd be safe there." It was the honorable thing to offer. It was also the last thing he wanted. She stopped, her hand still in the water. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "You said I have a place to go. Is this not it?" "Finch won't stop until he has this land, or I'm dead," he said, the words stark and ugly. "This isn't your fight." "My father sold me for a bottle of whiskey," she said, her voice sharp with a pain she rarely showed. "A man in San Francisco bought me like a horse. Here, in this house, you have asked for nothing. You have given me a name and a roof. You have treated me like a person. So yes, Mr. Vance. It is my fight too." He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the woman who faced down prospectors, who found the missing dollars in his ledgers, who threw a blanket over a rattlesnake, who served tea in the middle of the desert. He had thought he was protecting her, but in 100 small ways, she had been protecting him. He walked over to the small wooden chest where he kept his important papers. He pulled out the deed to the homestead. It was a single sheet of paper, worn at the creases, but it was his whole world. It was the one thing he had earned for himself after the war, the one piece of ground that was his. He laid it on the table in front of her. "This is the deed," he said. "It's in my name. If something happens to me, Finch will try to take it. He'll say you have no claim. As a widow, the law is on your side, but you'll have to be fast. You'll have to go to the territorial office in Prescott and file the claim immediately. He pushed the paper toward her. It was the most honest thing he could offer her, a future, even if it was one without him. She looked at the deed, then back at him. She reached out and placed her hand over his on the table. Her touch was light, but it sent a jolt through him. "Nothing will happen to you," she said, her voice full of a certainty he did not feel. "Because we will not let it." 3 months later, the autumn air had a crisp edge to it, and the cottonwoods along the creek were turning a brilliant gold. The house was changed. There were curtains in the windows, sewn from old flour sacks but clean and neat. A small, thriving garden grew in a patch of earth Mai had tilled herself, producing squash and beans that would see them through the winter. Arthur had secured a new contract, a larger one, hauling silver ore from the mine directly to the railroad spur 40 miles south. Mai's sharp mind for numbers had helped him draft a proposal that was both profitable for him and cheaper for the mining company than Finch's offer had been. They were building something, together. The war with Barton Finch had not ended in a blaze of gunfire. It had ended with a quiet visit from A.U.S. Marshall. The railroad had its own investigators, and when a second attempt was made to sabotage a freight shipment, this time one of their own they had hired Arthur to carry, they had sent for the law. The marshal, acting on a tip from the mine foreman and evidence Arthur provided, discovered that Finch had been systematically cheating the railroad on land grants for years, using fraudulent claims and intimidation. His entire empire was a house of cards. Finch was gone, his ranch in the hands of federal receivers. The wind of power in Redemption Creek had shifted. People who had once snubbed Mai now nodded to her in the street. Mr. Abernathy was suddenly offering them generous credit at the store. Arthur rode in from the freight yard one evening, tired but satisfied. He saw Mai in her garden, wearing a simple dress of blue calico, her back to him as she staked up a late-blooming tomato plant. The crimson silk dress was packed away in a trunk, a relic from another life. He dismounted and walked toward her. He had a piece of paper in his hand, a new one, fresh from the territorial office in Prescott. He held it out to her. She wiped her hands on her apron and took it. It was a homestead deed. But this one was different. At the top, in the clerk's neatest script, were 2 names, Arthur Vance and Mai Vance. She looked up at him, her eyes shining, a small smile playing on her lips. She didn't need to say anything. He saw it all in her face, the long road she had traveled from the water trough to this small patch of earth that was now, finally, hers. "It seems," he said, his voice a little rough, "that you have a place to go after all." She folded the deed carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket, her hand resting over it. "Yes," she said, her gaze holding his. "We do. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.